We continue with the first phases. But in the beginning, the delta was not inhabitable at all. The whole of it was one vast shallow inlet of the sea. Then the silt, which the floods brought down from the Anatolian hills and deposited in the gulf where the sea waters slackened their current, formed a bar, enclosing a stagnant lagoon, which, as the silt filled it and the salt water turned to brackish with the intake from the Tigris and Euphrates, became a marsh, densely overgrown with giant reeds. Gradually the edges of the marsh dried, and islands formed in it, and the dry land, all waterborne, silt, enriched by the decayed vegetation. Was astonishingly fertile. The dwellers in the north saw what seemed to them a miracle, saw the creation of a new world as the waters were gathered together in one place and dry land appeared. Yielding herbs after their kind. It was a desirable land, and they were not slow to take possession of it. This miracle of creation took place comparatively late in human history. The immigrants who moved downstream into the delta were living in the latter phase of the new Stone Age. They were not nomad huntsmen, but agriculturalists. They were primitive, but possessed nonetheless a culture of their own so distinctive that wherever their settlements are found, the modern excavator has no doubt of their identity. But it is not yet possible to say what racial stock they belonged. But they were a northern people, is certain. A culture identified with that at Al-Ubaid extends over northern Iraq and across to Syria, and a branch of a kindred stock occupied the Persian highland and found the city of Susa. No, we kind of really do know the racial stock. Let's just call them Persians. Because it's really not appropriate to say there's as many as people think. What is there? What, five types of genomes? And you know, 19 races, not 54. This was before Darwin, though, wasn't it? No. But Darwin had an idea of 54 races, but he divided he divided Caucasians into way too many groups for that to be a scientifically valid distinction of hereditary groups. If, as is likely, they spoke the language, which latter was that of the historical Sumerians, their northern origin is the more assured, because it is agglutinative. It's an agglutinative tongue, structurally similar to Old Turkish and Mongolian and Chinese, which happen to be the same type of genome. On sites far to the north and in the neighborhood of Mosul, the antecedents of the old Delta settlers can be traced back to their savage beginnings, but those who came to Ur were already in the flower of the Al-Ubaid period. Their most characteristic product, which is indeed the hallmark of the age, is the finely painted pottery, of which examples are shown on Plate 1. All the tools used by the Al-Ubaid people were of stone. Their settlements are littered with vast numbers of flint hoes, used for tilling the soil, flint scrapers for cleaning skins, flint knives for all purposes, drills of flint are obsidian for leather work. They kept flocks of sheep and goats, and spun the wool and wove it into the cloth. Though the men preferred to wear a kilt of sheepskin, cured with the fleece still on it, men and women alike loved to wear strings of beads, simple discs, chipped out of soapstone, shell, or yellow carnelian. They grew barley and harvested it with sickles of burnt clay, and ground the grain on a flat or saddle-shaped stone querns. They caught fish in the marshes. Those who elected to live on the margin of the higher desert, looking over the marshland, built themselves houses of mud brick. The marsh dwellers were, perforce, content with such reed huts as shelter in the marsh Arab of today. We may assume that the first incomers were adventurers, single families who pushed down into the new land and settled by themselves on any path of soil that had risen above the waters and gave promise of an easy livelihood. But as time went on and the arable land increased in acreage, the arable land increased in acreage, families grouped themselves together in villages and even in towns. This was inevitable. The fields, fertile as they were, had to be irrigated and drained if that fertility was to endure, and this is more than the isolated peasant farmer could undertake. It required corporate effort, not only numbers, but organized numbers. And so, from the needs of agriculture, there developed a social system whose natural outcome was an urban economy. Moreover, as the network of canals became more complex and the recession of the marsh made water of ever greater value, quarrels would arise as to the ownership of the canals and prior rights to the water that they brought. So wars began between neighboring communities, and men whose daily work was in the fields found it safer to spend the night in good company behind walls that might safeguard them from attack. The village developed into the walled city. This took time. At Warka, the accumulation of superimposed ruins of the Al-Ubaid period is such that it must represent at least 2 or 3 centuries of urban life. At Ur-too, the town had risen to a considerable height, as new houses were built above the leveled remains of the old. But this long growth was come to a sudden end. At Ur, digging against the northern margin of the Al-Ubaid town, the excavators came upon a bed of clean silt, 11 feet thick, which had been deposited by a flood, whose waters had broken against the obstruction of the town mound. Below the silt were the remains of houses, which those waters had destroyed in their first onset. Mesopotamia is a land of floods, but in all its latter history there is no record of such a flood as this. For that heap silt to form, there must have been 20 or 25 feet of water, which would have covered the whole of the delta. Between the Iraq Desert and the foothills of Elam, and from Hilla, which is Babylon, to the Persian Gulf. This can be none other than the deluge, which was the subject of the most famous of Babylonian legends, the Hebrew version of which is familiar to us all, of the story of Noah's flood. Now, people say, oh, there's a flood myth. It must be all the same flood myth. There's actually, we see it's more likely to be the flood of getting rumbly in the tumbly. It's more likely to be the flood that caused the Black Sea, and there was an increase of the Red Sea and some other such things going on. The deluge must have destroyed all the villages and scattered farms, all the inhabitants of the open country. It spared the larger towns, which high on their artificial hills overtopped the waste waters. But those who survived the disaster were a weakened and a dispirited remnant. Once more the delta was an empty land, crying out for a population to recreate its fertile fields, to clear its clogged canals, and replant its palm groves and gardens. Once more there were people ready to accept the call. The transition from the period of Al-Ubaid to the period of Uruk is not marked, so far as archaeology can tell, but by any signs of violent conquest. The newcomers came in peaceably and were perhaps not unwelcome. Again, we do not know exactly who they were, but they too were northerners, a hill people, not savages, but possessed of arts and crafts of their own, which were speedily grafted onto the indigenous culture of Al-Ubaid. The transition is curiously illustrated at Ur. In a pit there was found the rubbish deposit of a potter's factory, which began business shortly after the flood and was active for some generations after that. The earliest refuse in the deeper levels is composed of broken fragments of characteristic late Al-Ubaid pottery. Most of the unpainted wares, as if the demand for the old painted vases had fallen off, all was handmade or turned in a slowly revolving stand. Then, mixed with these at a higher level, there began to occur examples of the Uruk wares, plain red or smoky gray, spun on the wheel, and amongst the pottery fragments there was found an actual potter's wheel, a thick disc of clay about 3 feet across, with a hole near the rim for the peg handle by which it was spun, and heavy enough to go on, revolving of its own momentum. Now this, about 92 centuries ago, right, was the carbon dating for this event that could have possibly been witnessed as a fiery mountain falling into the sea or something like that, while falling in, well, obviously a comet or something, or meteor, I'm not using the right word, but you know what I mean. Because that lower southern area was no longer, but the hills, no, it's the highland, the artificial hills and stuff, they didn't survive that flood. But there was another flood of a greater Mesopotamian flood than the usual one. Anyways, above this, the pottery was wheel made. Here was visual proof of a revolutionary change, of the machine superseding the pure handicraft. All that the introduction of the wheel was due to the Uruk people, there could be no doubt at all, nor was this their only contribution. They were metal workers, and with their arrival the Stone Age in Mesopotamia came to an end, and a natural bronze alloy took the place of flint. They had been builders in stone when they lived in their own hill country at the north, and although stone was hard to come by, and the land formed by the 2 rivers, they still clung, for tradition's sake, to its use. The art of stoneworking was familiar to them. They quickly became masters of the land, but it would seem that they mixed freely with the old Al-Ubaid people and were not ashamed to learn what could profit them from the experience of the older race. A remarkable proof of the continuity of tradition from the Al-Ubaid period to latter times is given by the architecture. The most primitive building of the marsh settlers was the reed hut, and it was built in this way. Bundles of tall reeds, lashed together, were planted in the ground in 2 parallel rows. The tops of each pair of these fascines were bent inwards and tied together so as to form a series of arches, and then the other bundles were lashed horizontally to the uprights to make a solid framework. Onto the inside of this framework were tied woven reed mats. If wood was used at all, it was only for the door and door frame. The effect given was that the panels were separated by attached columns. The early builders in mud brick simply translated this into their own material. The only difference was that with square molded bricks, the attached columns tended to become pilasters or buttresses, which might be either simple or double. And all through Mesopotamian history, no temple or building of the sort was ever set up which did not, by its recessed and buttressed walls, recall the reed hut of the Al-Ubaid period. Again, the palm trunk inevitably gave to the earliest settlers the idea of a column to uphold, for example, a porch or a door lintel. The Uruk builders translated this into a brick column covered with an incrustation of colored clay studs, set in patterns which suggested the frond bases of the palm trunk. And the first dynasty temple found at Ur on the Al-Ubaid site, actual palm logs encrusted with stone and bitumen and mother of pearl were used. And much later, in about 1950 BCE, a king of Larsa flanked the gateway, which he added to the ziggurat terrace at Ur, with 3 columns of molded mud brick imitating the palm tree's surface in every detail. This continuity of tradition certainly implies that the old inhabitants were not simply reduced to slavery, much less exterminated by the Uruk invaders. The two stocks assimilated, and, if we may judge by the material evidence of their civilization, best exemplified by the wonderful discoveries made at Warka, it was from their union that the real Sumerian people was born. Uruk was at the height of its power, its rulers spending their wealth in spacious buildings magnificently adorned, when suddenly a new people appeared upon the Mesopotamian scene. At Ur have been found many graves of these Jemdet Nasser people. They are distinguished by a type of painted pottery, of which the chief characteristic is a geometrical pattern. Painted in buff and black against a deep red background. It has no precedent in any of the older Mesopotamian wares. Another feature of the graves is that their extraordinary wealth of stone vases, pots, and bowls and cups of limestone. Steatites are translucent alabaster, like calcite, got from stalagmitic deposits in the Persian Gulf. They were great workers in shell, using the core of big conch shells, which also came from the Persian Gulf. They developed, if they did not actually introduce, the art of writing The earliest inscribed clay tablets, which are purely pictographic, date back as early as the Uruk period, but even so may due to the earliest Jemdet Nasr encumbers. Well, perhaps we can say that they're hieroglyphic because you have combinations that actually, I don't know if they actually use pictographs. Just because they form pictures, it's not quite the same as a pictograph because it's actually you're representing the sounds. You're using pictures to show the sounds, much like what we got there. That's not pictographics either. Date back as early as the Uruk period, but even so may be due to the earliest Jemdet Nasr encounters. But in the Jemdet Nasr age, pictographs give place to a true linear script in which the signs are identical with those of the cuneiform writing of historic times. See, if they correspond to the cuneiform, then, you know. But, that probably did, start with pictographic writing. It's tempting to connect these Jemdet Nasr immigrants with their undoubted associations with the Persian Gulf, with a mysterious and only half human beings who, according to late legends, entered Sumer coming up from the sea and introduced to a still semi-barbarous people the arts of writing and agriculture. In fact, all the arts. One thing about them we can safely assert, whether they came in by armed conquest or, as is more probable, by infiltration, in the end they made themselves masters of the whole South Country, for the evidence of their culture occurs throughout the length and breadth of it, though it fails in some of the northern sites. And it is certain, too, that the tyranny of their rule at last drove the old inhabitants, who were their subjects, to open rebellion. Not only does the characteristic Jemdet Nasr pottery, with its rich decoration and color, disappear abruptly, giving place to plain red and gray wares reminiscent of the Uruk period, but almost always the building of the latest Jemdet Nasr phase bear the marks of destruction by fire. Usually, they have been deliberately razed to the ground and replaced by new constructions. The new buildings, erected by the victorious champions of the old order, invariably possess one peculiar feature. The bricks of which they are constructed are not of the flat type used in all previous ages and familiar to us today, but a round top like cakes, an impractical shape for which there is no technical justification. Very often, especially where the new building is a temple, the great quantities of broken shards of Al-Ubaid painted pottery have been collected and mixed with the mud mortar. It is perhaps not too fanciful to see the adoption of the plano-convex brick, a symbol of national revulsion against anything the hated Jemdet Nasr people had used, and in the Al-Ubaid potsherds, representing the beginnings of Sumer, an affirmation of the traditional whose continuity had been for a time so rudely interrupted. The early dynastic period, which now begins, though it preserves the art of writing ode to Jemdet Nasr, is in all other branches of culture a direct descendant of the Uruk age. Such an outline is the history that leads up to the royal tombs in the first dynasty of Ur. One has to picture now the whole river valley, and indeed the steppe country to the north, bordering the middle Euphrates as dividing up between a number of small city-states, each boasting its capital town, owing a more or less extensive domain of the rich farmland, watered by a network and laboriously maintained canals. The racial elements which made up the population were perhaps not equally distributed, but nonetheless all alike from Mari in the extreme northwest to Eredu in the south held a common culture, a common language, and racial distinctions counted for little. And it does seem to me that he's probably exaggerating race if every other country or something is a different race. The states were divided against each other. I mean, not even in Africa or Australia, where you have more genomes than any other continent. 36 genome types in Australia, 6 genome types African. By African, I include the, up by Israel and, Arabia and stuff. If the states were divided against each other, it was by historic tradition and by the rivalries and ambitions of the royal houses. Each city-state had its own kingly ruler, but under the guise of royalty, the base of the social system was theocratic. The same religion prevailed throughout the whole land, but each state had one of the common pantheon for its particular patron entity, and that entity was the real king, the earthly ruler, being content to entitle himself the tenant farmer of the entity. When two city-states engaged in war, as they often did, usually on the ground of landmarks displaced or disputes about water rights, it was the entity who led his forces to battle. When one city was so far successful in war that its ruler could claim overlordship over all his neighbors, and his house could be ranked by analysts as one of the dynasties of Sumer. And then the entity at city became the principal entity of the Sumerian pantheon. It may be that the alien Jemdet Nasser folk had, as conquerors, for the first time imposed unity upon the quarrelsome little kingships strung along the valley of the two rivers. Certainly after their day, the political history of the country for many centuries resolved itself into a record of the rise and fall of overlords who, starting as vassal rulers of a single city, succeeded in casting off the yoke of the paramount state and making themselves masters of the four corners of the world. There's evidence that some of this happened earlier than people realize, because carbon dating has put some things back. 7,000 something BCE was actually, when Sumerian culture sort of started to establish itself. But among the cities which thus achieved a temporary suzerainty was Ur. But before the first dynasty of Ur came into being, the rulers of the towns who were still, though they called themselves kings, were vassals of some more powerful master, governing perhaps from Erech, had attained such wealth and power as could provide them with the tombs now to be described. Just outside the wall, which enclosed the temenos of Ur, the sacred area within which stood the terrace tower of the moon entity and the main temples of his cult, lay in open space, which 3,000 years before Christ, well, if you know what Christ means, you can't say that that's just Jesus, but you know what they mean, was the burial place of the citizens of Ur. Later on, in the days of Sargon of Akkad, Göbekli Tepe is where you definitely see the start of these Christ figures, but, well, I can't say you see the start from them, but you definitely see that sort of idea existing. I mean, the non-Christian form of it. Later on, in the days of Sargon of Akkad, about 2560 BCE, the area was used again for the same purpose, and the gravediggers disturbed hundreds of the earlier tombs Later still, after 2000 BCE, houses were built over the ancient cemetery, and the discovery of old graves containing treasure induced men to tunnel deep into the soil in search of plunder. Then, most of the royal tombs we found had been robbed long ago, and the repeated working of the soil had confused the stratification. But nonetheless, it was clear that the original cemetery was a little earlier in date than the first dynasty of Ur, a dynasty of kings whose historical existence had been first demonstrated by the excavations of the temple at Al-Ubaid set up by Anapadda, the second of the royal line. See page 27.